Well, I hope everyone is well, and I'd like to offer a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Spirituality and Sustainability Global Network, and welcome to this month's Conversations program. And it's such a pleasure to welcome new and old friends, and I hope we'll be able to join together in a conversation after Dr. Beal has finished his chat. We'll open up to questions. And so if you could hold your questions until we complete the initial conversation, and then we'll join together. Now, my colleague Ensign from SSGN is in his car in Mexico. So I got to apologize maybe for the lack of clarity of the audio, but I'd like him to just to introduce our speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ensign Cowell, who is a founding member of the board of SSGN. Ensign, would you say a few words to introduce our esteemed speaker?
Yes, thanks so much, Jim. And thanks so much to Timothy Beal, Professor Dr. Timothy Beal, who teaches at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Coincidentally, and somewhat coincidentally, Tim and his wife Clover, who's a Presbyterian pastor in Denver, are friends from way back in the Cleveland area, Cleveland Heights. Dr. Beal has written 9 books, numerous monographs, research. He is, interestingly, now into a technophile, which I didn't realize. I don't know much about that part. But one of the wonderful things about Dr. Beal's books is that they are readable even to regular people like ourselves. And his latest book that we're going to be talking about tonight, Time is Short, is very interesting. And we had a discussion of a couple of weeks ago on our conversation. This week, we're going to hear it from the man himself. We're so thrilled to have Timothy with us. Thank you.
Should I go ahead and begin?
Please.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Ensign, for your introduction. Thanks, Jim, for putting this all together, and thanks to everyone who was here last time for your graciousness in returning after I got my time zones mixed up and wasn't here for for the event. Speaking of technology and ecology, Ensign, the image of you like in among a bunch of grass or aloe or something, I can't tell what that is, with a seatbelt on. It's your virtual background while you're in a car, I think. But fascinating to reflect on just that. Anyway, thank you all for being part of this, and I look forward to this conversation. I'll say a little bit about my book, which is When Time is Short, Finding Our Way. The virtual background doesn't want to see it. Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene. I'll kind of give a nutshell introduction to that, and then a few kind of post-book reflections that I've had in the year and a half or so since the book came out, and hopefully that will open up to some good conversation with everybody. I really appreciate what you all are doing with the SSGN, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. So, the book in a nutshell. Just a little bit about the book. Just first of all, a couple of terms, and I think you all are familiar with these terms, but just in case, I'll go ahead and highlight them. They're important in relation to the book. The first is Anthropocene. It's in my subtitle, and back in probably 2021, early 2022, when we were finalizing the title and subtitle, it was a bit of a question whether the word would be familiar enough by the time the book came out to be used in a book subtitle, and we gambled that it would be. I think maybe it will be the word of the year in 2025 or so. But a short definition, since I think it is more familiar for most of you, is that it's the new era we are in in our biosphere. It's the new geological era that we are in, and it's the first era in which human caused action and behavior are the main force of change in our biosphere, in our ecological system. Probably most would say began around the middle of the 20th century, post World War II, with the atomic bomb, with the increase in urbanization and international travel, and the number of McDonald's, and the amount of fertilizer we use, and all of these other things. You can go and look online and just image search Anthropocene, and you see all of these graphs where you get this exponential growth in those kinds of things. So that's an important one. It's an era that could possibly outlast us, insofar as anthropogenic or human-caused changes in the biosphere could outlast humans in the biosphere, the effects of our actions and behavior. The second phrase that I want to highlight is human exceptionalism. And in some ways, this is another way of saying anthropocentrism, but I think it's saying a little bit more than anthropocentrism does. Human exceptionalism is this idea, or really faith, I would say, belief that we as humans are somehow accepted from and exceptional to the laws of nature that govern the rest of creation. We developed this term in relation to other familiar phrases such as American exceptionalism, white exceptionalism, European exceptionalism, Christian exceptionalism, heteronormative exceptionalism, and we could go on and on. But it's an idea that I think in our Western culture is certainly rooted in certain ideas that are extracted from Christian tradition and really sort of underlined and emboldened and drawn out of biblical tradition, for example, around this idea that humans are created in the image of God and are charged by God to subdue and have dominion over the rest of creation. So human exceptionalism has some roots in Christian religion, but I think that it is sort of the religion of capitalism, if you will. It's the religion of the modern West, and it's one that we're all sort of immersed in. This belief that we can science and engineer our way out of anything, really. And so that's related to the Anthropocene, and also an important concept that drives a lot of what I'm doing in the book. So a little bit about the book. I like to tell my students that they should have prepared an elevator speech or an elevator pitch for anything that they're working on. So let's say they've got an idea for a TV series, or they've got an idea for a research project, a grant project of some kind, or an idea for an invention, or something else, a book they want to write. That's me. And so you need to have an elevator pitch. And what that means is that if the person who could really help you make it happen, this idea you have, ends up on an elevator with you, and you've only got that elevator ride to tell that person enough about your idea, your project, whatever it is, to get them hooked, then you need to have that elevator pitch. And so in this case, I have 3 different elevator pitches. I have a short elevator pitch, which is a 3-floor elevator pitch. I have a shorter elevator pitch, which is a 2-floor elevator pitch. And I have a 1-floor shortest elevator pitch. And so the short elevator pitch, the 3-floor elevator pitch, is that this is a book about our denial of death or finitude or mortality as a species, how religion has contributed to that denial, and how religion might also be religion and spirituality might also be a way of breaking through that denial and finding hope, deep hope, as opposed to shallow optimism on what might be a finite human future. So our denial of human finitude, how religion has contributed to that, and how religion could also be a resource for breaking through that denial. That's the 3-floor short elevator speech. And I've got a little bit of a cough. I might have to pop a cough drop in a second here. And I've also taken sips of water along the way. The shorter 2-floor elevator pitch is short, so get ready for it. This is not another before it's too late book. This is a what if it's already too late book. So what if it's already too late to avoid some kind of ecological catastrophe, ecological crisis, ecological collapse? We all should be doing everything we can so that it's not, but what if it is, and shouldn't we also be talking about that? That's the 2-floor shorter elevator speech. And then the 1-floor shortest elevator speech is maybe the most provocative, and we can talk about this as we move forward. But I sometimes describe this book as a palliative approach to the human future. A palliative approach to the human future. Talk more about that maybe later. The shape of this book I take from my teacher, Walter Brueggemann, who probably some of you know of, a very important theologian, biblical theologian. And he thinks of the arc, or the sort of narrative shape of the prophetic imagination, of the way the prophetic poets, artists in the biblical tradition confront the empire in terms of what he calls reality, grief, and hope, moving from reality to grief to hope. And that's over against the empire's movement from ideology to denial to despair. And so over again, and he's talking, for example, in the Bible about the Solomonic Empire, the empire of King Solomon. If that empire is presenting this ideology of, let's call it Israelite exceptionalism, we're God's chosen, nothing's ever going to go wrong for us. We are accepted to and accepted from all of the laws that govern everybody else, and God's always going to be on our side. If that's the ideology, sounds a lot like American exceptionalism, and that's no accident. If that's the ideology of the empire, the prophet is confronting that ideology with reality. And the reality is things are not looking good. Babylon is coming, and confronting the empire with its oppressive practices and policies with regard to those most vulnerable, most marginal within that society. So confronting the ideology of the empire with the reality of what's actually happening is the first move. Second, when the empire's ideology of exceptionalism starts to fall apart, it moves to denial. This is not happening. Exceptionalism is still it. Our ideology is holding fast. That denial is what the empire is going to assert in the face of what seems to be starting to happen. The prophet confronts that denial with grief. This is really, really important in Brueggemann, and it's important in my book, the value and importance of grief and giving voice to grief. The prophet confronts denial with grief, gives voice to grief over what's already happening, the harm, the pain, the suffering that's already happening, and the harm and the pain and the suffering that is baked in and that is going to happen. And then, only then, for the prophet, can you move to hope. You cannot get to hope without moving through grief. And that's really important. So the hope then the prophet offers is over against the empire, which after its denial falls into despair and has nothing to offer. The prophet then is offering hope for possibility, for something possible, for some sort of future possibility over against that despair. But it's really, really important to understand within Walter Brueggemann's understanding, and this is really core to my book, I have a chapter called No Hope Without Grief, that you cannot get to deep hope, real hope, costly hope, without moving through grief. You can get to optimism by skipping grief, but you cannot get to hope. There's a difference between shallow optimism and deep hope. And so that really shapes my thinking in the book. Kind of what I'm trying to do is to confront our human exceptionalism with the reality of the real possibility of our mortality as a species, of all of the collapse and catastrophe that we are probably looking ahead to on the horizon and are already starting to experience, and then to give voice to create spaces to give voice to grief over that, grief over what's already happening, grief over the harm that's happening and that is already baked in, and grief over what we know is coming. And then finally to move to hope through grief, over against despair. I think despair is an understandable response to optimism. It's what we're doing all the time, swinging back and forth, right? Ourselves as individuals, whether we're talking about the elections or whether we're talking about the latest COP, or climate solutions and climate crisis and all of those things, we're constantly swinging between optimism and despair. But I think hope is something different, is something outside of that back and forth swing between optimism and despair. And that's the work that I think we, groups like you, networks like you, people like me, and the communities I'm part of, and the students I work with need to be working on, is what does that hope look like? And I suggest in the book that in some sense, that hope is palliative. It's not about restoring or getting back to some original ideal. We are facing some kind of a crisis, and that we can learn some things from palliative care in the healthcare world about what it might look like to do that work of hope as a species, as communities, as societies, to sort out the difference between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering, and to learn how to live with necessary suffering and how to alleviate unnecessary suffering. That's something we talk a lot about in palliative care. To seek reconciliation and restoration of relationships, to seek forgiveness, to give forgiveness, to do reparations, to work on social justice in that way, and then also to get back in touch with our own selves, with our own embodied selves in this creation, to cultivate what I call in the book a kind of earth creatureliness, that is not about transcending our place in creation, but rather about subscending, about descending into the creation that we are part of, the food web that we are part of, the interdependent set of relationships that we are part of and not exceptional to. So that's what I mean by earth creatureliness. To me, that all is hopeful. So I was very discouraged. I had this great interview with Grist, and nowadays everybody knows Grist. They were a little bit newer back in early 2022 when I talked with them, but they're now on NPR. They're kind of the main climate news source on NPR radio stations and so on. But I had this great conversation with a reporter there, an interview, and he wrote what I thought was a really fair and appreciative article about my book. And then when I saw it online, I just happened to, and you can see this in the chat, I just looked at what the URL is, right? The web address is for my piece. And lo and behold, and I don't know, I doubt she wrote this. I think it's usually a tech engineer or something someone who's doing web design who decides what to call things. But whoever it is, this isn't the title of the piece that was written about the book, but it's what was there, and it says, "When time is short, review Timothy Beal, Climate Doomer, Religion." Well, I'm sorry, I don't feel like I'm a climate doomer. I think maybe some people who just look at the book and hear or read the back cover or something like that might think I am, but I hope I'm not, and I would love to talk about that too. I feel like um, what I care about is finding hope that that acknowledges and lives with the bed we have made for ourselves, the reality we have created for ourselves. And I teach at an engineering school. I love engineers. They are very solution oriented and problem solving oriented, and I think that's wonderful. But they want to talk about this question too, so that's the book. Just a couple post book reflections, and then we can kind of go from there to hopefully to some conversation. Give us a close to a half an hour. So post book conversations that I've been having when I give talks like this in different contexts, and a lot of times I'm talking to, let's say, communities that are somewhere between liberal progressive and left of that. So liberal progressive to post-Christian to pagan communities who really want to talk about what might be the calling of religious communities like that on the horizon of some kind of climate collapse, which might also coincide with the democratic collapse. And David Orr and others are talking a lot about the entanglement of democracy and climate, and that the collapse we're looking ahead to could be an entangled combination of those two. But what might be the calling of religious communities on this horizon? What are the needs, the hungers, the anxieties, the concerns out there in mainstream culture that we might be uniquely prepared to address and to give language for and practices for and spaces for? Because in our mainstream capitalist culture, there really just isn't much beyond optimism and despair. And in fact, there's sometimes a lot of shaming and guilt inducing responses to anyone who says anything that's not optimistic, right? Or feels anything that's not optimistic. I have a lot of undergraduate students who struggle with climate grief and climate anxiety, and don't find that there are spaces for them to address those things. So, what might we have as religious communities to offer into that space? That feels like a really big question to me, and I think maybe perhaps we can think about ways of creating new spaces for people to confront that denial of human finitude and the reality of the bed we've made for ourselves, to give voice to grief. This is reality, grief, hope. I think it's very valuable to give voice to grief and to find deep hope as opposed to shallow optimism for a more meaningful way forward. And I just wonder if that might be the prophetic and the pastoral work of communities like ours in the Anthropocene. I think that we have resources that we disregard and that we don't recognize the value of. We have language in our various scriptural traditions and other traditions like that. We have ritual practices. We have poetry. We have myths. We have just an understanding that spaces need to be created for this kind of work. And so that's something that I feel personally called to be reflecting on and thinking about. As I sort of suggested, I think that Walter Berkman's sort of arc of reality, grief, and hope really can be helpful in thinking about that work. I don't think that it's necessarily simply a matter of moving from reality to grief to hope. I don't think there's necessarily a narrative arc there, but rather that it's an interreaction and interplay of reality and grief and hope, that we might even be feeling and embodying two or three of those at the same time, but that we're moving back and forth between reality and grief and hope, and reality and hope, right? So that could help us think about how we shape spaces to to allow that kind of work to happen. Um, in my own tradition, I identify with a Protestant, with a fairly left-leaning Protestant Christian tradition. I'm married to a Presbyterian minister. Now, as of 3 weeks ago, I can say I'm also a father of a Presbyterian minister. Our daughter, Sophie, who just finished at Yale Divinity School, just got ordained barely a month ago. So now I'm married to and father to Presbyterian ministers. So I'm very embedded in that Protestant Christian culture, but I'm also a religion professor who works and thinks about religion in a much, much broader ways than that. As a teacher, I don't speak from that particular tradition, but I do think a lot about what we do with, as Christians, in my case, what we do with these inherited religious traditions. Do we sort of leave them behind? Do we reimagine them? Do we keep them, preserve them as they are? And my good friend Nadia Bolz-Weber will say that there's two things we can do with inherited Christian scriptures and theology and so forth like that. We can either cremate them or compost them. And I think that, she might agree that we could also just preserve them, but I don't think she's interested in simply preserving them. But on the one hand, is there nothing to do with them? Are they hopeless? And do we just need to cremate them, just burn them, just let them go and invent something new? This might be something that you all in your network think about sometimes. Or do we try to compost them? Do we sort of turn them over with a spade and see what what new things might grow and emerge from these inherited traditions, which is a kind of a life from death. But I think in some ways that is always what's happening in any religious tradition. So we could think about that not only with regard to Christian tradition, but also with regard to other religious traditions. And so that's another theme: reality, grief, hope as a shape, composting religion as something that we might consider as we do that work. And then the other thing I think a lot about these days is the importance of possibility thinking, of the imagination, and of inventing new possibilities. We are very good at problem solving, but problem solving is not the only task here. Possibility thinking is something very different from problem solving. Problem solving, you stay on a linear path, right? You're presented with a problem, you solve that one, and the next one presents itself, you solve that, and you just keep going on that path, right? You're never going to jump the rails. You're never going to imagine something truly different or new. Possibility thinking, Adrienne Marie Brown, who, if you haven't read, I really recommend. She has a book called Emergent Strategy, where she talks about the science fictional imagination. She's being inspired by science fiction as a space where we try to do possibility thinking. We try to imagine alternative futures that are not simply the result of problem solving, but that actually almost jump the rails and try to think of outside of those the kind of problem solving mode into new spaces. And so I myself, for inspiration, am trying to read more science fiction, what's often called cli-fi, climate fiction, CLIFI, which is sci-fi that is climate oriented. would be delighted to talk with you about some of that too. But I think I'm done there, Jim, and look forward to the conversation. Thanks for listening to me.
Oh, thanks so much, Tim. And so what we like to do is invite everyone to participate in a conversation and ask questions or make a comment. And if you could possibly raise your hand with the icon, and then if we'll ask Natasha to unmute you, or alternatively, if you could just raise your real actual hand, that we can also ask Natasha to open it up. So would anyone like to begin with a comment or question? Don't be shy.
I'm available.
Thank you.
My name is Beatrice Briggs, and I've had the pleasure years ago of studying with Matthew Fox and Brian Swim and Thomas Berry, all of whom, I mean, that's a powerful combination right there. And now, then I lived for 30 years in Mexico, and now I'm back in the United States trying to find my way forward and what can I bring to the table here in this new situation and in a context of a Protestant church, which is fairly, you know, innovative, but not so tuned into any of this that I can see. And the only thing that has occurred to me, and it's clearly because of my influence from Brian and Thomas and others, is to say, well, this isn't the whole story, but being able to share what the bigger cosmological story arc is and say, look, all these millions of years and the role of the human, what Thomas Berry called the great work of the human, to bring our capacity for reflection on these things and making, and because otherwise, we're just signed up for going down with the Titanic or whatever. I mean, he doesn't say that, but but so I'm really interested in any suggestions that you or others have about if you were trying to bring a congregation or a faith group together to think about these things in a useful way, who aren't specialists or intellectuals necessarily, but any suggestions?
Wow, Beatrice, you got to hang out with some pretty amazing people.
I did.
Yeah, that's incredibly special. I have to admit that in my own Protestant theological education and seminary, especially Thomas Berry and Matthew Fox, who I really discovered after seminary, were kind of dismissed. It was a very reformed theological Barthian kind of Karl Barth influenced kind of theological environment. And so it was later teaching in my early years at Eckerd College where I discovered Thomas Berry and Matthew Fox especially. And I think a lot about especially Thomas Berry, but that whole discourse, right? Those and others that you didn't name who are part of that conversation too, who there's a lot of influence from T.R. Desjardins, the Catholic process theologian, that leads into that. Many of the people I'm in conversation with and who resonate with my own thinking are very, very much, connected to that discourse. And I thought about whether I felt comfortable bringing that into this book or not. I think I might have brought Thomas Berry in just a little bit because, and I use him in my classes all the time. And in fact, when undergraduates read some of his pieces, and there's some beautiful video conversations that he did toward his twilight years, and they're just so beautiful and thoughtful and inviting. And these students of mine, especially the ones who have some Christian background, because mostly I'm teaching non-religious, non-Christian students in a secular university, but they're just amazed that even exists as a possible way of being a Christian. The two that that most kind of blow them away that way are Thomas Berry and Sally McFague. And, Sally McFague is an ecofeminist theologian, also influenced by T.R. Desjardins in some ways, but goes in a little bit different direction that probably is more aligned with my own theological thinking. Anyway, that's a lot of preface. I think those scholars and theologians are so important. One of the things that I struggle with, you kind of brought up, Beatrice, and we can talk about this, is that there is still a sort of notion of a kind of special place for the human in this story, in terms of Christ consciousness, or however we want to talk about that. And I struggle a little bit with that, and I'm not sure I go all the way there, and I'm not sure that letting go of that feels necessarily like despair to me, because at least for me, and I'm just speaking right now in terms of my personal religious life and spirituality and kind of consciousness, the idea of being part of something bigger than me, even if I'm not sort of what's keeping the narrative arc going, is okay. And maybe that's a little bit of a kind of Buddhist sort of way of thinking about it in some ways too. But so that's my first thought about that. But I steer everyone who identifies with, Christian theology, especially my students, to Thomas Berry and Sally McFague, because I feel like they are the ones opening up new directions. And really that's because what they're talking about is theological anthropology. What does it mean to be human if we let go of some of this sort of anthropocentric, human exceptionalist ideas of the human as godlike over against and exceptional to the rest of creation? How do we work out what it means to be human? And back to composting versus cremating, I think there's some stuff that we've inherited that we just need to cremate when it comes to Christian theology, and even maybe like there's probably only a couple verses in the Hebrew Bible that contribute to that, but they sure have been elevated and hooked into that kind of human exceptionalism. So thank you, Beatrice. I don't know if you have any response.
Just one thing that came to mind as you were talking about, I heard Thomas giving a talk one time, and when it was over, there were a bunch of nuns in the front row, and they called him Father Tom. He always just, but they were concerned. The woman stands up and she says, "Excuse me, Father Tom, I notice you don't talk about Jesus very much." And he gave that North Carolina laugh because he said, "Yeah, well, if Jesus had to depend on me, he'd be in a hard way."
That's really good. My
Yeah.
teacher Walter Brueggemann used to say, "I'm not paid to talk about that," because he was an Old Testament professor. Although he talks about Jesus a lot these days. So yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you, Beatrice.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, can we invite someone else to ask a question or make a comment?
Joe?
Joe, there's Joe Holland.
Okay.
Hi, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Tim, I read your book some time ago, and it's wonderful. Thank you so much. So my comments are not a criticism of your book. You've done more than enough in the book. It's really just about further thought, maybe after the book, maybe for your part B there. But particularly since you teach in an engineering school, the dominant force is techno-science, techno being the engineering side. But surprisingly, you have not yet addressed too much technology and science historically.
Right.
You say that religion, Christianity, Western Christianity, ordains science. But I think at this point, science and technology don't even need that anymore. They're on their own, and they're also, and in their main form, obviously they're in the frontiers of science are wonderful ecological developments, but the inertia of established science and established technology are extremely destructive in terms of the threat of nuclear war and ecological devastation. So have you given a further thought to looking at examining the dynamics of science and technology too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. It's a great question. It's something I think a lot about. I just stuck an article post in there that where I try to address that a little more directly in a piece called "Tech for the Anthropocene," and also in that piece, I I talk a little bit about my sort of schizo self because. On the one hand, the me that you get to know in When Time is Short, especially in the chapter about my dad and my bear encounter and things like that. Growing up in Alaska and spending a lot of time in the woods sounds like a very different thing from this other part of me, which since 2015 I've been really kind of more and more immersed in the computer programming language of Python. It's opened up all kinds of new interesting things for me. I'm directing a new program at Case Western Reserve called Experimental Humanities, which is about integrating the humanities with new and emerging technologies. So, and as you say, Joe, so much of our sort of, as my teacher Walter Bergerman would say, techno-military global capitalism is anything but uh, fostering any kind of sense of earth creatureliness, and really is part of our capitalist faith in infinite growth through extraction. I'm also trying to think a lot about, and I'd be interested in what you all think, trying to think a lot about, I don't want to be a technophobe, and I don't want to pretend like technology is not always going to be part of human society and human culture. And so wanting to think more about what different kinds of technologies might be leveraged to cultivate earth creatureliness, as I say in that little piece. And so I encourage you to have a look at that. It's a short article, and so that's another thing I think a lot about. A book that has really resonated for me around that question is by, I'm going to forget his name, James. I forget his last name, but the book is called Ways of Being. James Bridle, as in like a bridle. Ways of Being, and he's an artist who's also a sort of tech experimenter and an ecologist. And what he's looking at in that book, and what he's encouraging us to think about, is what it means to be human in a more than human world. That's the way some of us are trying to, instead of non-human, more than human. And part of what that's about is to reflect on other forms of intelligence, other ways of being in a more than human world. And what he's wanting us to consider is not just, ways of being such as groves and rhizomes and plants and other animals, but also machines. And that's the provocative part of what he's talking about. So he talks about networks, and he talks about AI, and he talks about some of these other things. And he acknowledges, as you would too, Joe, that these technologies, most of them are emerging out of military and capitalist contexts, but can we use them? Can we use them subversively, maybe? And then the other thing, just to quickly, is that I find science fiction to be really inspiring around this. One that just has two science fiction books that I would recommend that have really been interesting to reflect on. They're both very ecological and very technological at the same time. One is a book series called the Monk and Robot series. They're all about a relationship between a tea monk, a new religion in the post-climate catastrophe world, and a robot who discover each other and are learning from each other. The first of the two books is called A Psalm for the Wild Built, So that's one I'd really recommend. And then the other is a book called A Half-Built Garden, written by an author who has really deep connections with Judaism, and another just beautiful reflection where religion and technology and earth creatureliness are intersecting in interesting ways.
Could I get back to that?
Please, please.
I mean, you've laid out the whole thing of science and technology, or more technology, looking into the future, which certainly is extremely important. My question was more about the past. Just as you've delved into the past of the tradition of religion, or Western Christianity in particular, and its interpretation of the biblical tradition. So I'm concerned about delving into the past of the philosophical groundings of science and technology in the past. You hinted at a little bit with mentioned Bacon at one point in your book, but I think we need to unearth that, because without the critique of the past of science and technology in a very scholarly way, it continues. A lot of it continues on its own inertia. And for example, one I don't know if you know the work of David Noble, who was an historian of technology. He taught a history of technology at MIT. But for just kind of one dramatic example, he wrote a wonderful book. We now know that modern science and technology really grew out of medieval science and technology. It was not, they changed the philosophical foundations, but all the scientific technological developments had already been underway well before Descartes and Newton and all of that. But Noble was very curious about why it went the wrong way. And he wrote a book, World Without Women, The Clerical Origins of Western Science. And he makes a fascinating analysis that is this lopsided thing coming in these male enclaves of celibate males who had very sophisticated scientific laboratories and stuff in these monasteries and so on, and their universities have a very limited, in a cynic sense, yin yang, have a purely yang sense of what science and technology, and so it actually becomes a very phallic direction and so on. So he might be right or wrong enough, but those kinds of looking, just as you go back to critique the religious past, I think it's important, and from a theological viewpoint to do that, it's important from a philosophical point of view to go back and critique the technological past and the scientific past. And I don't think we'll escape from its clutches unless we really do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. And sorry for that long excursion in a completely wrong
that's
direction.
Well worth it too. Well worth it too. It's not either or. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I'm familiar with Noble, and I'm thinking, I mentioned her in the book, Evelyn Fox Keller, who is a feminist historian of more of science than technology, but definitely connected, and also Susan Bordeaux, who does some interesting work around that. I think it's a masculinist understanding of nature as object. That's part of what we're talking about there. So I appreciate that title as well. In a simpler form, which I think is a nice resource for any conversation with non-scholars, if you just put Lynn White's famous short essay, I'm forgetting what it's called, from Nature magazine. It's from the late 60s. And he talks about the medieval merging of science and technology being sort of rooted in that Genesis passage I mentioned, and some other Christian understandings like that.
I have to jump in because with the Assisi conferences that we've had, I've developed the paper I still haven't finished, but critiquing Lynn White. He fundamentally misunderstands medieval Christianity, which was predominantly Celtic and Germanic tribal peoples who had a sacramental consciousness. And he has no knowledge of it's based on tremendous ignorance of the actual historical situation. Surprising for a medieval historian, but
right. And he really only talks about that for a couple paragraphs.
Yeah, but he says terrible things, and they're really
very general.
That would fit in very well with British imperialism. But
I agree with you. I agree with that critique. From being a biblical scholar, I think what he does with very briefly with the biblical stuff too is is problematic. I like to put that, because I'm more interested in the biblical dimensions, I suppose, but I like to put that alongside Wendell Berry's critique of it, and I like to call it the Berry White debate.
Oh, great. Yeah. I mean, one
You
final.
know who Barry White is, right?
Yeah.
It's a joke, but
Yeah.
anyway.
One final comment that, and I could be wrong in this, but in my interpretation, at the foundation of modern Western technology and science is the return to the atomistic materialist philosophy of Epicurus. The first 1,000 years of Christianity were about Plato. The medieval period, at least, had some significant turn to Aristotle, but definitely modernity went with Epicurus. And yet, almost nobody reflects on that. It seems to me that's a very important thing to delve into, and at least in my view. And again, I could be wrong, but that's the key to understanding modernity. And unless we uncover that and examine it and critique it, it still will hold power over us. That was my argument. I'll cut off at that point.
I appreciate that. I need to read more of your work, and I think you know more about that than I do, but I would assume that that has something to do with the an understanding of nature as a sort of object.
Thank you. Can
Thanks,
we
Joe.
switch to Gary or Joe Iannone? Gary, if
you're
you could
muted.
Unmute.
Just real quickly, I'm not as deep as you guys are in your understanding of some of these things, but the term that you've used, Tim, is other, and the term othering came to me through Pachamama Alliance, and I think it is one of the things that is really basic to all of the problems that we have in all of our systems, no matter what the system is in our government or in our culture, the whole concept of othering. And for a long time, I used to say that, as we grow older, it's our responsibility to increase the size of the circle of we and us. But I never thought of it in terms of the only way to do that is to reach outside of the circle to the other folks and bring them in. And so that whole concept of othering and belonging is really, really critical. And a dear friend of mine, a Quaker friend, just sent me something about the nature of the really conservative politics that we've got going on, and the crazy politics that we've got going on now, is how people get sucked into it in a sense of twisting their values just a little bit and get them to do that. And Adam Kinzinger was one of the samples that they used. They asked him to do something, and then he got a little deeper and a little deeper, and then all of a sudden he saw what was going on, and he was able to back out. But a lot of people cannot. And well, I've got the floor. I just want to share with you, Ensign and I have been part of an organization that's called Reset. And it's an environmental organization here in Fort Myers. And we've recently said that we were going to have much more of a spiritual orientation, basically coming out of the work that we've done with Pachamama. And so our new, and it's always been an acronym, and our new acronym is with some understanding of, thanks to Thomas Berry and Thich Nhat Hanh, it is, and I'll show it to you here, as human beings, our great work in the 21st century and our prime interbeing responsibility is to truly be restoring Earth as our sacred ecological trust. And I think that for us says a whole lot. And of course, you can use those terms, the reset term, in any organization to reset your thinking about where we are and where we're going and what our part in it might be.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, and for your comments about othering and those dynamics. For me, I was introduced to that kind of language first through feminist theory. and Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, where he really develops this argument that the male and the masculine are sort of defined over against the female and the feminine, as other to the I, to the masculine ego, the masculine self. And then post Simone de Beauvoir feminist theory, Luce Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, Helene Cixous, folks like that started thinking about the ways in which there is agency as other, that can, in some ways, really deconstruct the masculine identity of the masculine I in feminist theory. But we can think about that in so many ways. I wrote a book about monsters that really tried to talk about, like, there's no such thing as monsters, but we construct monsters, which are projections of otherness that, over against which we define ourselves. But those kind of binary oppositions of us versus them, they're always vulnerable, they're always brittle, they're always fragile, and they're always breaking down. And that is an opportunity for the us to allow ourselves to sort of lose our own centrality, our own stability as subjects in relation to others. And we can think about religion in that way. Religion, on the one hand, is sort of like creating a sense of us over against them, and then religion, in another sense, we can think about even justice in the biblical tradition in both of these ways. On the one hand, us versus them. On the other hand, an openness to the other, a hospitality to the other that invites the other in such a way as to completely change what it means to be us, right? And I think that's part of what you're talking about there. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Yes, and do we have another comment or question?
Joe wanted something, I thought.
Joe Iannone, did you have a comment?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
No, I've just been, kind of listening. I guess part of it is at what stage of life you're at. At my stage, I find hope by taking action. And with system thinking and networks and how should I put it? People around the world, I don't want to call it the noosphere, but people around the world acting to change and to be generative and to respect the earth and to change the capitalist monolithic thing. I get great hope from that. So I understand about grief, but I think there's a point beyond grief where you take action. And I see people around the world, networking, systems theory, Capra, Thomas Berry. I see a lot of that taking hold. And I think it's a new birth, frankly. There's a lot of pain, a lot of struggle, but I see birth happening in the community. So I appreciate everything that's been said. I just listening, but I just want to say I get hope from taking action. And there's a lot of people connected in systems, and you can change the tipping point. The tipping point doesn't have to go to destruction. The tipping point could go to regeneration too. Yes. So anyway, it's just more reaction. I appreciate everything you said. It was very enlightening and it was very informative to me. I took a lot of notes and I'll be meditating about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I totally agree. And I'm sure you are familiar, you probably are familiar with Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, her book, All That We Can Save, and then her very new one out, which I think is What If We Get It Right? And I love that. And I think that's the right way to live and be in the world, even if all we have is today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. And I often think of the tipping point of Maimonides, who said that, we don't know when or how or where, but even one more prayer could tip the difference in the direction of tikkun olam, of healing the earth. Anyway, I think Ensign wants to say something. Ensign, did you have your hand up? Or was that just the safety belt?
No, actually, no, the seatbelt. I'm out of the seatbelt. Amazing.
Yeah,
so I can say something. Yeah, thank you all. I got home safely. This is wonderful. Tim, thanks so much. It's really quite provocative and thoughtful. And I think you're right about you have to be realistic, and that's got to be the grieving part. And then that leads you to be hopeful. And I think the hopefulness that I think those of us that are in that camp we're going to work out of hope and out of possibility. And that's that positive imagination and all of that. And Tim, you referenced in the epilogue, and we're going towards this youth forum at Chelmsbury Place, hopefully in a couple of weeks, about the rage and the anxiety and the impassioned pleas of the young people like Shia Bastida and who was daughter of one of our former board members, Geraldine Bastida. Anyway, yeah. And I think, to me, it's a question of how do we help young people be empowered to speak to us and get that energy, because typically, I say most all of older people care about what young people think and about their futures, if they have any sense of community or communal altruism. And so I think, to me, giving voice and empowering youth to be heard and seen and be part of the discussion, be at the table. What are the indigenous people? We've done a lot with indigenous and recent. And one of the things is they don't want to be taken care of. They want to be at the table. And I think that's, to me, one of the big things about young people and hopefulness.
Yeah.
Please, any ideas, any thoughts, reactions?
Oh, well, just amen to that. And too often I see this a lot. We've got this thing, and how do we get young people involved? Well, we need the young people to be designing the thing, rather than participating in something that we've created and that we've designed. And that's hard for us to do. It's hard for me as a professor to do. I'm trying to really rethink what I do in the classroom and come in with a kind of open structure to invite the students to, in some sense, create the course and to participate in that and do the design thinking around that. But yeah, I think that's our big challenge. We have these ideas and these things we want to do and these organizations and so forth. And then how do we get the young people involved? Well, there's got to be a different starting point from that. I think that's what I hear you saying you're working on too. And so much of it is just empowering and asking, what should we be doing, and following their lead.
Yeah, very well put. So we're actually nearing the end of our time, so I don't want to keep you up too long. So does anyone else have any question before we wrap up? Well, if not, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Tim, and also for Ensign, as well as to the entire SSGN network and to all our friends here tonight. And we'll be putting this on YouTube in about a week to 10 days, and Natasha and Kolisha will be working on that, and they've assisted us so ably tonight with the operational aspects of the program, enabling it to go so smoothly. So I'd like to express my sincere thanks to them. So I hope you can tune into our next program in October, and we'll be notifying you in about a week or so of our next program in October. So to everyone, I'd like to say good night and wishing you good health and happiness and harmony.
Thanks so much. Thanks for welcoming
Dr. Beal.
me, and I enjoyed this. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.